So while we wait to get started and your colleagues to come in, like some logistic that has nothing to do with the logistic equations. So if you want to follow the notes, they're on GitHub. So if you put like my first name, Stefano Allesina.github.io, and then there's a ICTS 2025. So you find like the same lecture notes. So if you get lost or like you want to go back like tomorrow and say, what was he talking about? You can see it there. And then of course, we're going to review a lot of stuff that cannot be summarized in 4 lectures. So I put here like some resources on like theoretical ecology and on the mathematical backgrounds that it's needed really to fully appreciate the material. And then in the lecture notes, like there are parts that are in blue, like this kind of mathematical review, which are things that I thought you would know, but I was not exactly sure. So I put them in this thing that we can click on it and expand it or contract it, depending on how do we feel. So when we encounter some blue things, I will ask you, do you want to review this or are you fine with it? Okay. So this is just the logistics. And I don't know, Jacopo, should we start or should we wait? Yeah, it's 2. Okay, fantastic. So it's like 2:30 a.m. Chicago time. Perfect time to lecture. The sun is shining. I had my coffee. And my name is Stefano Allesina. I'm a professor at the University of Chicago. And I have 4 lectures planned for this week. I'll be here. Unfortunately, I'm leaving on Sunday. And these 4 lectures are centered on something that you've already heard like this morning, the generalized Lotka-Volterra model, which, by the way, turns 100 years old in 2026, depending on how you count, right? Like we will see the history of the model in a second. And the idea is that these 4 lectures, plus there's a more practical tutorial that Abby will do on Thursday, they're not equal length. So don't worry if we only get through half of the first lecture material, right, in the first lecture, because I used this first lecture to introduce a lot of basic and non so basic facts about Lotka-Volterra that then we're going to use to explore like different themes. For example, what happens to dynamical models when we put just random parameters, and then how do we relate experimental data to the GLV model, and finally we will see that some other nominally different types of model, for example, metapopulation dynamics, can be understood in light of Lotka-Volterra. For all these notes, there is like a GitHub repository associated with it where you can download all the material that is needed to compile these notes. So all the code, all the figures, etc., are there if you want to see. They rely very heavily on these 2 packages in R, so I put them here. And then I'm going to write x of t as typically like we're going to work with many populations. So x of t will be some sort of a vector of densities of all the population at time t. And typically I will just write x instead of x of t because I'm lazy, right? You will see x always depends on t in all the lecture notes. And what we measure with x is like, say, the mass per area or mass per volume, some sort of density of the population or the number of individuals per unit area or unit of volume. And then just to orient you in the notation that might be familiar or not, we will use Greek letters for scalars, lowercase Latin letters will be vectors, and then uppercase letters will be matrices. And then other little notation, I'm going to write 0 of n is just like a vector of zeros of length n, and 1 of n is the same, right? A vector of 1s of length n. And then the rest, I will remind you of the notation when we get there. Okay, so as I said, like 4 lectures centered on these Lotka-Volterra models. So I thought that it would be fun to start with the history of this model that is named after Lotka and Volterra. So this is Alfred J. Lotka, and this is Vito Volterra. So these are like the 2 people that gave name to these equations. And I mean, there's a lot to say about both of them. What it's very interesting about Lotka is that he was a very peripatetic scientist, both physically in the sense that he was born in what is now, it used to be the Kingdom of Poland, but now is Ukraine. but then studied in Germany, in England, and then moved to the US. Then got like a PhD after he moved to the US, but still from Birmingham in England. So he moved geographically, but he also moved in the space of science quite considerably, right? Like he worked a number of like strange jobs, including an editor for the Scientific American. He worked in the US Patent Office, maybe trying to emulate Einstein. And then he worked in the Metropolitan Insurance Company. So if you see like the papers of the time of Lotka-Volterra, they're written from the Metropolitan Insurance Company in New York City. He authored more than 100 papers and 5 books that have titles like The Value of a Man, where the value is measured in dollars, right? Because it was for an insurance company. So how do you account for like somebody dies, how much money should they get? So that was the value of a man. And he started like things, for example, he has one of the first papers on bibliometrics. So measuring scientific productivity by scientists. But among many other things, starting in 1910, inspired by some other scientists that were just like starting to model biological systems mathematically, he started working on differential equations relating to either chemical or biological, depending on the paper. They look very similar models, dynamics. And then in 1920, there's this paper in PNAS that I like very much, especially because of the sense of surprise that it's in the text, right? So he says, it was therefore with considerable surprise that the writer, on applying his method to certain special cases, found that these lead to undamped and hence indefinitely continued oscillations, right? So this is what we call now the Lotka-Volterra predator-prey model that leads to sustained oscillations that go on forever. And just to say that in this case, he was actually talking about ecology. He went on to describe a species of organisms as one, a plant species, say they're deriving its nourishment from a source presented in such large excess that the mass of the source may be considered constant during the period of time which we are concerned. And 2, a species as 2, for example, a herbivorous animal feeding a species as 1. So this was really a consumer resource or like a predator-prey system. Now, these equations were published in 1920 in PNAS, and then in 1926, so a few years later, Vito Volterra, that you can see that like Lotka was born in 1840. In 1880, sorry, so Vito Volterra was 20 years older than Lotka. And in fact, like in 1926, when he wrote this famous equation, he was like 66 years old, right? Like, which is not a spring chicken, as they say, right? Especially for a mathematician. So this was a famed mathematician working on the theory of functional. He was born in Ancona, that at the time in 1860 was before the unification of Italy, was still part of the Papal State, in a Jewish family, which is not great if your king is also the Pope, like the head of the Catholic Church. In a very poor family, and like to make matters worse, his father died when he was 2, so he had to move. He and his mother had to move with like some uncles, and so he went to Turin and then Florence. And when he was in Florence, he had a professor in high school, Antonio Roiti, that also dubbed up like as a professor at the University of Florence. And this was a physicist, and noticed that this teenager was extremely strong mathematically, so encouraged him like to keep studying, and convinced his uncle to send him to the university. So he applied to the Scuola Normale di Pisa, which is like at the time was the top school for mathematics and physics in Italy, and receiving a degree in physics, but really working on mathematical physics in 1882. And then the next year he was made full professor of rational mechanics in Pisa, and then went on for a stellar career. He became like the president of the Accademia dei Lincei, which is the oldest scientific institution in the world. Galileo Galilei was part of this academy, and he became the first director of the National Research Center that he founded. Unfortunately, being Jewish, these were the times where Italy then was taken over by fascism. And in fact, in 1931, the fascist regime asked all the university professors to sign this oath of loyalty to the regime. And out of like about 1,250 professors in Italy, only 12 refused to do so and were kicked out of academia. And Volterra was one of these professors. And So how does an aging mathematician become interested in ecology all of a sudden? A famous aging mathematician, and it turns out that Volterra had a daughter. This daughter fell in love with her professor of biology, Umberto d'Ancona, who studied fish biology. And Umberto d'Ancona had tracked like the fisheries in Trieste, like where Jacopo works, before and after World War I. And during World War I, like the Adriatic Sea was basically closed off because of like the war. And so there were basically no fisheries for a number of years. And so what d'Ancona had observed is that some species of fish had grown dramatically in numbers while some other had not. And so, you know, you can imagine like Italians, you know, on a Sunday you go and have lunch with your in-laws. And so he must have described this thing, and I can picture like Voltaire writing on a napkin these equations, right? And so he was like, this is interesting, you should publish it in Nature. And so he did. So in 1926, there's like this very short paper to Nature where there's no equations. By the way, there's like one diagram of like the population cycling in the phase plane, but the rest is described in English, which makes for a very difficult paper to read. This is actually just a summary of much longer paper in Italian that was published in a different journal. And, you know, he studied like the same equations as Lotka. He had like a little more of intuition about like the dynamics, and especially he described this, what is called the Volterra effect, right? Like the fact that when we reduce the death rate on both predators and prey, like it's not obvious that both of them will increase. And he described this as law 3, and it's very funny also, like the language of this was only 100 years ago, but the language that we use right now for papers is certainly not this. A complete closure of the fishery was a form of protection under which the voracious species were much the better and prospered accordingly, but the ordinary food fishes on which these are accustomed to prey were worse off than before. Right? Wouldn't be like science be a better place if we could write papers still like with this kind of flair? Anyway, but so in this paper, he described like this summary of his results, and then in this other longer paper, he actually has equation and he studies besides the predator-prey case competition and other things. And then, you know, you publish this paper in Nature, and Lotka, who read Nature, was like, wait a second. I wrote the same equation and I have the same graph that you have in my book that I published in 1925, Elements of Physical Biology. And so he writes to Nature to claim priority, and Volterra was very gracious and acknowledged the priority. But it's funny because Lotka concluded it would be gratifying if Professor Volterra's publication should direct attention to a field and method of inquiry which apparently, as hitherto, passed almost unnoticed, right? So like the paper by Lotka had basically no follow-up, right, besides those of Lotka himself. And so Volterra, you know, recognized this priority. I'm sorry not to have known of his work, et cetera, and then says that we, starting from different points of view and working independently of each other, we found about the same results. And then he concludes, I agree with him, his conclusions that these studies and these methods of research deserve to receive greater attention from scholars and should give rise to important application. And 100 years later, we're still talking about this model. So I think they were both right. And it's just too bad that there is a graphic novel that is beautiful. Here I just put one page on the life of Volterra. Unfortunately, it's all in Italian. So I've been talking with the authors and like with publishers trying to get like this to be translated into English as well for the centennial of Volterra. But like this is the part where it explains the model of Lotka-Volterra. All right, enough of history. So I'm going to start with the equations. So these equations, actually, you've already seen some equations like there are Lotka-Volterra because the exponential growth is a special case of Lotka-Volterra and the logistic growth as well, right? So both of them. And so we can write like dxi dt. We can write this as xi dot, right? So just to be shorter. And then this one is going to be xi times ri plus the sum over j of aij xj, right? So what are these things? So I is the density of population I at time t. Then we have a parameter r is like the growth or intrinsic growth rate or the decay rate, right? That rate of population I. So this is what would be achieved by population I if you were to grow population I by itself, starting at low abundance. Initially, it would either grow or shrink exponentially with this rate. And then we have, so this is a vector, column vector. And then we have a matrix A that is a matrix of interaction describing the effect of population J on the growth of population I, right? So you can imagine that if numbers are negative, Aij is negative, it means J depresses the growth of I. If it's positive, it enhances the growth of I, right? So imagine this is just a square matrix of size n times n. So I'm always concerned with the case in which these J or like all these population go from 1 to n. You can write these equations slightly more compactly in a vector form. So I'm going to write x dot is d of x. So with d of x, I mean a diagonal matrix with x on the diagonal times r plus ax. Okay, so these and these are the same equations. Okay, then we can, in fact, you've already seen a minor modification of this notation is the idea of taking Ri out of the equation, right? So that this one becomes a 1. And you've seen this already in Daniel's lecture. So what happens is that we can say xi dot is equal to xi, and then we multiply and divide by Ri everything, right? So we take Ri out, we get 1 here, and then here we have the plus the sum over j of 1 over Ri, because we have divided by Ri all the equations, aij xj. Okay, so I'm going to call these bij throughout all the lectures. A is like this matrix of interactions. When I want to write it in this way, I'm going to call it B, where bij is 1 over Ri times aij. Okay, and if you want to write, so this one is bij. So this notation is very convenient when we want to look at the equilibrium of this system, right? Because the equilibria only depend on the matrix B. They don't depend on this number outside. This is especially useful notation when the Ri's are positive, but you can do it in general as long as they're not 0. While this type of equation written in this way, it's much more convenient. We will see when we do like analysis of stability. So I'm going to cycle a little bit between the two notations. If you want to write these with B in matrix form, you can do like x is still diagonal of x, Hadamard product, so the element by element product R, and then we have one vector of size n plus bx. Okay, so this is the notation we're going to use for these equations. And as I said, you've seen these equations already in particular cases, right? If, for example, A is a matrix of zeros, then we recover like the exponential growth or decay. If A is a diagonal matrix, then each species would grow logistically. Okay? So we want to say something intelligent, if we can, about the GLV model, like this generalized Lotka-Volterra model for the case of many species, right? So the first thing we're going to look at is, we've seen like both in Abby's lecture and in Daniel, the existence of equilibria. So we can ask, where will there be equilibria for the generalized Lotka-Volterra model with n populations, right? And so if you look at these equations, right, any equations that start like with xi here, right, these are called Kolmogorov equations. Many models in population biology are of this kind. Why? Because of Spallanzani, right? Like that he was citing Spallanzani, that there's no spontaneous generation. So when you have 0 of a population, it remains 0, right? If we have 0 elephants here, right, they will not start all of a sudden appear elephants out of nowhere and start growing. And so these things act as a barrier such that you cannot cross 0, right? When the population reaches 0, then it stops. You cannot go negative, right? For example. And this also tells you that, as it was done already, when this number is positive, you can divide both sides by x of I, right? So when we do like 1 over xi dxi dt, Another way to think about this quantity is if I take the log of xi, and then I take the derivative with respect to time, right? I would get exactly this quantity, right? So this is also the derivative of the log of the population, right? Or the per capita growth rate, right? So then this makes a lot of sense, like to do this kind of thing when we're multiplying by xi, because we're saying, okay, there's a number of individuals or a certain density of the population, and each one contributes a certain amount, the per capita growth rate or decay rate to the total population. All right, so we have this model. The first thing we're going to do is to say whether there are equilibria and how can we find them. So for this, it's convenient to use like the B matrix, right? So we have that each one of these equations, or here, right, is zero when we want the xi dt to be zero, and this can be zero either because xi is zero itself, so the species is absent, in which case, yeah, it's zero, or whatever it's in parentheses is zero. Right, so if we want to find a point in the space of like, imagine that this x typically belongs to what? To the real, in fact, to the positive orthant of Rn, right? Like, or the non-negative orthant of Rn, right? Because we want just to make sure these are population densities, so they cannot be negative, right? So it's a point here. So let's say, can we find an equilibrium that is in the interior of this positive orthant, so where all the populations are present at positive abundance? So if that's the case, we have like our equations, right? And we want to make, when we're saying all the populations are present, it means this number is not zero. So this has to be zero, right? So we want to solve the system 1n plus bx is equal to zero. Right, so we have n equations of this kind, right? So you can just move these on the other side. And then if this matrix is invertible, then we can multiply both sides by the matrix inverse, obtaining the solution. This tells you also what? That if the matrix B is invertible, if a solution exists, it's unique, right? Only if B is rank deficient, then you would have infinitely many solutions. These infinitely many solutions in biology, it's not going to go very far, right? Because when we're measuring these coefficients, right, we're making a bunch of assumptions that all the individuals are exactly the same and these coefficients do not change in time. All things that are not precisely true. So I would not put a lot of stock on mathematical results that rely on these metrics being rank deficient. I want to produce T-shirts that says biology because all matrices are full rank, right? Like you don't have to worry about a lot of the details over which mathematicians have to agonize because nature is fuzzy, right? It's a bit more squishy than mathematics. Yes.
Can you maybe say a few words about Can you maybe say a few words about the units of these XIs or just population density?
Yeah. We had like a slide at the very beginning, but we're thinking is either XI is say grams or like some unit of mass, right? Like grams or pounds or whatever you want over a certain area or volume, depending on whether you're looking at a liquid or an area. Or equivalently, like the number of individuals, how many elephants do I find in a square kilometer, like this type of things. Yeah, and these rates are rates of 1 over time, and these, because they have to be multiplied by mass, it has to be 1 over time over mass or over density. Good. So imagine that there is such a solution. Right, and imagine that what we're saying is that this solution is all positive. Then we would call this an equilibrium for the system, and we would say this equilibrium is feasible. Feasible means biologically attainable, right? Like that we can, if we were to engineer the system and we put exactly the right amount of each population, we can put it like at that state and it will stay there forever. So it's a fixed point unless we perturb it. And I wanted to show. So just to show you an example, right? So we could have this system, right? That it's defined by A, this matrix is 3 by 3, so there's 3 populations. they all are growing if led by themselves. They all have some sort of self-regulation, right? In fact, this could be a competitive system. Right? So from this, we can also derive the matrix B, which you can write as like the inverse of the diagonal matrix with R on the diagonal times A. This is my matrix B. And then I can try to invert this matrix, take the row sums, right? That's what this thing is doing, is just taking the row sum of the matrix inverse, the negative of the row sums. And so you would see that in this case, this population can stay at an equilibrium where they're all ones, right? Like 1, 1, 1 is an equilibrium for this system. Okay. Now, this is an equilibrium in which all three species can coexist at this equilibrium. But of course, I told you that this equation can also be zero when one of these x's or one more than one is zero, right? So we could say this could be an equilibrium for all the species taken together, but then we could also have three choices for which species we could put together in pairs, right? Like if we have three species, we would have three pairs. And then we also have three choices of species by themselves, right? So what happens to these subsystems? What happens is that you can take this matrix B and take a submatrix. Imagine that you have a set, right, K, that says I'm set K, I have a species 1 and 2. So I could take the submatrix that is induced by this set, saying I take the first and second row, the first and second column, and now I get a submatrix that is 2 by 2. I invert this submatrix, multiply by a vector of length 2, this time of ones, right? And I can see whether this subsystem has an equilibrium, right? That is feasible. What is the maximum number of equilibria that can be feasible then for this system, right? Like, or feasible for a subcommunity only? Well, we have 2 to the n ways of choosing this element. We don't care about the case in which we choose 0 species, right? Because we know the solution already. So it's going to be like 2 to the n minus 1, right? Minus the origin, which is always going to be an equilibrium for the system. Okay, so for this type of subsystem, I'm going to write B, and then I put K here to signify, or like KK, like depending on the notes, just to say I'm taking the submatrix that is induced by a set, right? And this set is typically not complete, otherwise I just write B. And so I can take this subsystem, invert it, take the negative row sum, and see whether it's feasible. So for the system before that, we saw that we had an equilibrium that was 1, 1, 1. Now we can say, can 1 and 2, species 1 and 2 coexist together? So we can take the submatrix that is taken only first, second row, first, second column, invert it, multiply by 1, and we find that there's an equilibrium that is feasible for species 1 and 2 being together, right? So if we were to happen to start without species 3, this system could also be sitting at an equilibrium. And then we can do this for 1 and 3, and we find also that there is an equilibrium for 1 and 3, and then we can do, what if I put only species 1 by itself? What if I put only species 2 by itself? And what if I do species 3 by itself? And all these cases are complete. While you cannot put in this system, you cannot have 2 and 3, right? Like if you try to do the submatrix with only 2 and 3, and you invert it, take the negative row sums, some numbers are negative. When these numbers are negative, means there's no equilibrium in the positive orthant, and therefore there's no feasible equilibrium. Okay? Good. So this is just like to say the equilibrium, like this matrix encodes all the 2 to the n minus 1 equilibrium, not only like the one where all of them are present. And then in terms of type of dynamics, Abby today showed us like that for maps, like the logistic map or like some other discrete equation, you can get very complicated dynamics with very simple equations. When you have differential equations of like the simplest kind, right? Autonomous differential equations that are first order, like we have here, you cannot. So like for one species, like what you have is really boring. So if you do a GLV model with one species, you can have only basically 2 outcomes. One is unbounded growth, so things go to infinity exactly as in the exponential growth case. Or the species will settle at some equilibrium, right? This equilibrium could be 0, in which case we would say the population went extinct, or it could be some other number like you've seen in the logistic growth. Yes?
Come from choosing R over and R varies from 0.
Just it again?
The 2 power n part, does it come from choosing R out of n and R varies from 0 to n? 2 to the n minus 1 equilibrium.
Yes. Yes, it comes from the fact that you can have one equilibrium with n species. Right? Then we can have n equilibria with n minus 1 species. Right? And then we can have, you know, n choose 2, etc., etc. You sum all these numbers, you get 2 to the n. This answers your question?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so for one species, nothing to write home about, right? It's either gonna go to infinity or gonna go to an equilibrium, so not very interesting. Now, when we go from one species to two, which we have not done yet, I was hoping that Daniel could finish his lecture and get to two, so that then I could go to infinity tomorrow. When we have two populations, we can have new behavior. For example, the famous Lotka-Volterra original predator-prey equation shows neutral cycling. Or you can also have things like this, right? This is, for example, a competitive system in which we have two species, right? And I start them at different initial conditions. And what happens is that depending on the initial condition, I go into one place or another, right? So if I start with more blue than red, then blue wins and red goes extinct. That's the solid line. And then if I start with more red than blue, you can see that red goes to some equilibrium and blue goes extinct. So we can have this bistability, right, or alternative stable states. But you need two species to have that with Lotka-Volterra. And then when we have three populations, we can have new behavior like stable limit cycles, right? So if I start the population in different trajectories, they all settle into a cycle, which is always the same. So we have an attractive cycle that attracts the dynamics. And then for four more populations, we can have chaos, right? Which is like non-periodic oscillations, exactly the same things that Abhi was mentioning for the logistic map, right? But for Lotka-Volterra, you need four equations to have the same type of behavior. Okay, but so just to say that Lotka-Volterra can produce a wide array of dynamics.
Why don't you have cycles in two species and chaos in three species?
It's very interesting. Like there is an argument. In fact, like very interestingly, this paper that proved that you need like 3 to have cycles and 5 or more in this paper, that is like a paper from 1976. It's a paper by Stephen Smale, which was a field medalist at the time. So I think it's the only paper written by a field medalist on Lotka-Volterra that I know of, right? Like maybe there's some other papers, and I've included it here, like, but I'm not including in the proof because we're gonna get like sidetracked. So for all of these lectures, if you look at the end, there is a, oh no, did I include it or did I not include it? I did not include it. I meant to include it. Okay, I will include it and then we'll be there. Sorry about that. But it's a very short, very, very clever way to prove it, but I think we would get out of our comfort zone. Okay. But then I want to show you something very peculiar in Lotka-Volterra, which is that when we have this kind of more complicated dynamics, what happens to the equilibrium, right? Like, of course, like to have a stable limit cycle, we need to have that if we have an equilibrium, it must be unstable, right? Because we want trajectories to go to like our limit cycle, or if we have chaos. So, but is this the notion of having an equilibrium necessary or not? Like, do we still need like a solution that is positive in the middle? And what I want to show you is that, yes, you need to have a positive solution for this linear system to have persistence of all the species in Lotka-Volterra. Not only that, the equilibrium is going to be the time average of the dynamics, right? So if I take these dynamics and I take the average, or if I take my limit cycle and I take the average, and I do it after sufficient time that the transients have elapsed, or the long time average will be exactly my equilibrium that is going to be feasible. Okay, so I'm just going to do a little calculation that shows that, and you can find it also on the notes. And to do this calculation, I'm going to choose like a very convenient, because I can, case in which dynamics are periodic. And in fact, I'm going to say like that x at time 0. So we start like this system on this cycle such that this is exactly the same as x after one period, which I'm going to call like big T or tau, right? Let's say tau. Okay, so I'm just going to take the average over a whole cycle. So what I want to study is this thing, right? We have 1 over t, and then the integral between 0 and tau of x of t dt, right? So this would be the average. Imagine that this is a vector, right, of all the integrals taken one species at a time. Okay, so now we have our dynamics. We have already written the dynamics of the logarithm. So why don't we do that again, right? So we say d of log of x dt, right? This is exactly going to be 1 over x dx dt. And so it's going to be r plus ax. Okay. So this is our dynamics for the log. And now if I say now I want to take the integral on both sides for t that goes between 0 and tau of both quantities, right? So I want to just do the integral here and the integral here between 0 and tau in dt, right? All these things, this depends on t. And these we have to have equality as well, right? Because they were equal to begin with. Okay, but now this one we can solve, right? Because we're integrating something derived by dt in dt, so we're gonna get exactly the log, right? So this you can solve automatically. We say this is gonna be the log of x of tau minus the log of x of 0. And what is this? It's 0, right? That's why I chose this formulation, because this is very convenient. So this has to integrate to 0, okay? And now if we do the integral on the right-hand side, well, and maybe we can divide by tau, you know, just because it's convenient. So now if we divide by tau and we're integrating a constant, we would get just r, right? Because we divide by tau plus, and then we have here a 1 over t. We can even just do it like this one, 1 over t. Let's say a integral of 1 over tau between 0 and tau, x of t dt. Which is almost what we want to compute, right? We're almost there, right? So, but now the left-hand side is 0. So what we can do is to move r on the left-hand side, and then we can multiply by the matrix inverse both sides. So what we get here is negative of a inverse r is equal to 1 over tau integral between 0 and tau of x of t dt, which is exactly what we wanted to compute. And this is what? This is our equilibrium, right? So if you take the average, even if this thing were on a limit cycle, right? You take the average of this limit cycle, you find exactly the equilibrium that is in the middle. That at this point must be an unstable equilibrium in the middle of the limit cycle. Turns out you can do a very similar calculation for any trajectory that stays in a compact space, or that is like bounded by some box in Rn. You do the same, which would happen, for example, for chaotic attractors, and you find exactly the same, right? Like the equilibrium is the long-term average of the dynamics. In fact, you can go a step further and say, well, a system can be permanent, meaning like that the species do not go extinct and they do not grow to infinity if it's bounded. And you have to have that all the axes. So when like trajectories get very close to one of the axes, it has to be repelled away, right? So based on this kind of argument on permanence, you can show that a GLB system without a feasible equilibrium cannot be permanent, and therefore that to have coexistence between species, either at an equilibrium or at a limit cycle or at a chaotic attractor, you need to have an equilibrium in the middle, right? That it's positive. So these things, if you want to see like the detailed calculation, you find them in the book by Hofbauer and Sigmund, that it's like a very
so here, the way this calculation will get modified if you have chaos is that that thing on the left won't be 0 anymore. Right?
Exactly.
So I'm curious how is it very hard to show that it still works out?
It's longer than what we have time for. But yeah, but you have to do basically the same type of calculation.
What guarantees there is stochasticity?
There's no stochasticity.
But if there is a finite problem.
Sorry.
Yeah,
this is a very strong guarantee. If it's stochastic, you're saying it's not.
If it's not stochastic, it depends how far away from zero are you, right? Like if you get very close to zero, all pigs are up, right? Like none of these results hold for. I mean, for a stochastic system, I can tell you, eventually everything is going to be extinct, right?
But
asymptotically, we're all dead. Yes.
But
yes.
If you put a very small spontaneous generation.
Yeah, exactly. Or you could have immigration, we would call it, like to be faithful to Spallanzani. Yes.
So, that the equilibrium, if the X star exists, the solution exists, an interior equilibrium point.
Yes. So the condition is to have persistence, you need an equilibrium. An equilibrium is no guarantee of persistence, of course, right? It goes in one direction. So you can have like the species persist together, if and only if you have a positive equilibrium in the middle. But having a positive equilibrium in the middle, that then maybe it's unstable and dynamics go to extinction, yeah, that you can still do.
I see. So,
like,
if this interior equilibrium point is unstable, then
yes,
it might get destabilized by, let's say, some periodic orbit.
right.
But the long time average in that periodic orbit will still be the interior equilibrium point.
Yes.
So persistence implies this, but the other way it does not.
Absolutely not. It goes on in one direction. It's not if and only if. Yeah. So if it is
Because
persistent, it has to have an
it can
equilibrium.
go to the boundary,
Yeah.
even if the point exists.
What you can say is like X does not exist, then it cannot be persistent. That is, you can also put like this relationship if you prefer. And that's the way I'm going to use it, is to say if there's no equilibrium in the interior, then this thing cannot coexist.
Professor, does the LHS, does it lie between x of 0 and x of tau? The value, is it bounded by x of 0 and x of tau?
Here it's not saying where I'm just saying they're positive throughout because I'm taking the logarithm, right? So they better be positive, but I'm not saying what these values are. Right? I'm just saying you have a cycle, right? And I'm just taking like, this is like x of 0 and x of t. So I take exactly like the dynamics after an entire cycle, just for convenience, right? You could do this otherwise. All right. So this is all I'm going to say about equilibria, right? So we've seen a way to find an equilibrium if it exists. We mused on the fact that, in fact, this matrix encodes not only one equilibrium where all the species can coexist together, but all the subcommunities that can coexist. And then we found out that having this feasible, meaning positive equilibrium, is a very important condition for having persistence, because in fact, without this, in Lotka-Volterra, you cannot have persistence. Okay, so now the next stage of Griff is what? We have a point in the positive orthant, and we want to see what happens when we perturb these points slightly. And so we're going to do exactly the same local stability analysis that Abby introduced as a Taylor expansion around the equilibrium point. And we're just going to do exactly the same thing, but in n dimensions. So let me just maybe show you on the notes, like for one dimension, this is what Abby was saying, right? We take an ordinary differential equation, autonomous of the form like the xdt is f of x. And then we're saying there is a population is resting at an equilibrium x star. We perturb the population abundance, and we want to track the dynamics of the perturbation, right? Which we can write as x plus some sort of perturbation that we take to be very small, such that then we can Taylor expand around this. So we define like delta x to be the difference between the state of the system and equilibrium. By chain rule, we have that d delta x dt is exactly f of x, exactly what we had before. We write f of x as delta x plus x star, right? Because that's by definition the same quantity. And so then we Taylor expand. If you don't remember what Taylor expansion is, you can click on this blue thing. This stuff will come up, and then you remember. I take you remember. And so we can write this Taylor expansion as f of x. We can take it as the function evaluated at the point, in this case x star, plus like the derivative of this function evaluated at x stars times the difference, right? That it's delta x plus higher order terms. This one is 0 by definition because we're at an equilibrium, and this is just a linear term, right? So we can write this d delta x dt is approximately just one number times delta x, which is what? It's exactly the same equation of the exponential growth that both Abby and Daniel showed you this morning. And so you know that if the growth rate, in this case, the growth rate being df dx at x star, this should be dt actually, is positive, then the perturbations will grow. If it's negative, the perturbation will decay to 0, and eventually we will go back to the equilibrium. So that's the logic for one species, and there's an example here for the logistic growth. This is like what people call local stability analysis, right? Because it's local in the sense that it only holds for very small perturbations around the equilibrium, because we're only taking the first term in the Taylor series, right? If you wanted to be, you know, a little less local, you could take the second term, right? But then, of course, like dynamics, it's going to be more complicated to do the dynamics. And in fact, in Lotka-Volterra, you would recover exactly the same model if you take the second order. And then we, Abby also introduced, and we're going to talk about it as well, more complicated tools that, however, can prove global stability, right? Meaning like any positive initial condition would lead to the equilibrium. Very interestingly, both of these methods were developed by the same person, Alexander Lyapunov, in 1892 in his dissertation. So like my PhD thesis did not include things that now everybody does every week. I don't know about yours. But a very impressive dissertation. This is called the Lyapunov's first method, like for local stability, and the one based on Lyapunov functions that were mentioned this morning is the second method. All right. I just wanted to make some space for the Taylor expansion. So now we want to Taylor expand this function fi, right? This would be the function for species I only. But we have now a multi-variable function. So when we want to write fi of x in the vicinity, right, and we can write this as still x star plus delta x in the vicinity of x star, what we have is, as before, we have the first term that is like the function evaluated at x star. And now we have many more derivatives, right? Because we have to do the sum over k of all the partial derivative of fi of x with respect to xk evaluated at x star times the difference between xk minus xk star. So this is the linear part, and then plus 1/2, and then the sum over k, sum over L of d square of f I of x dxk dxl times xk minus x star, xk star. Let me just erase a little more, and then xl. I knew that I needed to erase more. And then xl minus xl star, and then dot, 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 right? Many more terms. Okay, so now we can recognize this to be delta xk, and this is delta xk delta xl. And now, as before, that's okay. It's a bit ominous. Let me wait for a second. Okay, and so the first term, as before, is 0 by definition of an equilibrium. And then here we have a certain number n partial derivatives, all evaluated at this equilibrium. And we're going to call this JIK is dFi dxk, right? So this is what it's called the Jacobian. And so we can organize this in a matrix. And then if we discard, this would be the Hessian, right? It's another matrix here. If we discard these higher order terms, we end up only with the Jacobian. So if this is 0 and this is just a matrix, what we have is that we can write the equation for all the perturbations, right? We could write delta x dot would be approximately, right, 0 from here, and then we have this Jacobian evaluated at the equilibrium times delta x. Okay, so this is very similar to the exponential growth model. This is a linear system of differential equations, which, Leibniz could solve himself. If you don't remember how do you solve this, you can do this by eigendecomposition. So you can click on this blue part and we'll give you a brief overview of how to do this. But what it's important to remember is simply that what characterizes the stability of the origin, right? So the origin would be the perturbations have subsided, they went to 0. All that matters are the eigenvalues of this matrix, right? So if all the eigenvalues have a negative real part, right? So the eigenvalues of this matrix are generally going to be number in the complex plane, right? Where we have the imaginary part of the eigenvalues and the real part of the eigenvalues of this matrix. And if a matrix is n times n, generically we will have n eigenvalues, not necessarily distinct. So if all the eigenvalues fall into the left half plane, then these trajectories will all converge to 0 asymptotically eventually. Okay, so then the only thing that matters is the sign of the real part of these eigenvalues. All right, and I just wanted to show you how do you derive this Jacobian, and then when we evaluated the equilibrium for the Lotka-Volterra model, just to give you a sense of how would you do this calculation. And one thing that, I put a lot of things in my notes that are things that bother me when I have to review a paper. One of the things that bother me a lot when I have to review a paper is when people call this matrix evaluated at XR, right? Like they call this whole matrix the Jacobian, like there was only one, a different Jacobian for each equilibrium, right? Like, but the Jacobian does not include the equilibrium at all, right? So each system of differential equation will have only one Jacobian, and now you can evaluate this Jacobian at each equilibrium point, and you will get a different matrix that will have generically different eigenvalues. And so you need a second name, right? And people have a name for these matrix evaluated at equilibrium. Like the name is due to Richard Levin's, which we're going to see in chapter 4 of these lectures. And it's called the community matrix. So each system has one Jacobian and as many community matrices as there are equilibria in the system. So like these pet peeves, I'm gonna bother you with a little bit, but I'm getting older, so I deserve like the opportunity to bother you with things that bother me. Okay.
And if you take your multiple equilibria, Lotka-Volterra, they could generically be many because it's non-linear. You're counting all these boundary equilibria.
Exactly. For example, you could evaluate it at the origin. If I have no species to begin with, the origin typically, most population models is going to be unstable, but you could evaluate this there. You would have eigenvalues that are all 0, right? But then you could evaluate it in some other point that is one of the boundaries and see whether species can invade this system when I introduce this new species or not. All right. So let's just do this calculation for Lotka-Volterra, right? It's convenient to write it in a more extensive form, right? So we can write f of I, we could write it as xi ri plus the sum over j of aij xi xj, just because it's easier to, when we're doing derivatives, to think about this. So we can take d fi dxi, and we would get, from here, we just get ri. And here we would get the sum over j aij xj plus an additional aii xi that comes from the fact that this is a square. Okay? So this is the element of the Jacobian for the diagonal of the Jacobian, right? This would be what you find on the diagonal. What do you find? So this would be jii. And then jij is just the derivative of fi with respect to xj. And so in this case, there's only xj here, so it's very easy to do, aij xi. Okay? So this would be the Jacobian. Now, suppose that there is an equilibrium in which all the species are present, and we want to probe the stability of this coexistence equilibrium where all the species are present. So what is the definition of an equilibrium? Is a point in which the part inside the parentheses, which happens to be exactly this, is 0. Right? So then if I do JII evaluated an equilibrium that is feasible, meaning that this point is at equilibrium because the thing within the parentheses is 0, then this part cancels, right? So we would remain with only this part. We would just get AII XI star, and then here JIJ at a positive equilibrium would be AIJ XI star. Okay, so this is the community matrix taken from the Jacobian of a GLV model in which we have a positive equilibrium. You can write this in matrix form, right? So J substituting an equilibrium that is all positive is simply like the diagonal of X star times A. Okay, this is just a way to write these things. You see that you always multiply by the row, the species I, right? The one in the rows. So that's how you would write it.
So it's very naive, but Fi, when you sum over J to equal to I.
Yes, yes, like that would be interactions of a species with themselves. For example, as in the logistic growth, we saw that you had a negative effect of a population on itself.
Sure. So then when you calculate JII and you have the dou Fi by dou Xi, should there be a factor of 2 in the last term, or am I like?
This one is inside here because I'm summing also over.
Okay, so even there
one is J extra. Okay, this is the second term. Okay, does this make sense? Yeah, I just kept it this way because then it's easier to see that this has to be 0 at equilibrium.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Other questions? Okay, if there's no other questions, I can get into another one of my pet peeves, which is what is the relationship between the eigenvalues of A and those of D X star A? This is another source of confusion because people tend to think about the eigenvalues of A, like the matrix of interactions, and call it a A. But, you know, for example, X star depends both on A and on the growth rate, right? So if we were to think about only A, we're thinking all the models, like independently of the growth rates, would have the same dynamics, right? Like as long as they have the same matrix of interactions. And so just 2 thoughts about this. First, we can think about the case in which A is symmetric, right? So imagine that A is equal to its transpose. So Aij is equal to Aji. This is a very convenient framework because, for example, all the eigenvalues of a symmetric matrix are real, so it's easier to deal with them. And in this case, you can prove that if A is negative definite, meaning it has only eigenvalues that are, in this case, negative real numbers, right? Because symmetric matrices only have eigenvalues on the real axis. And so to be on the left half plane means to be all negative. Then any X star positive will not alter this negativity of the eigenvalues, right? So imagine that A is equal to A transposed, and then we want to know what are the eigenvalues of X star A with respect to the eigenvalues of A. So what we can do is we can do a similarity transformation. So similarity transformation is when you take a matrix and you multiply on the left by, say, a matrix, and on the right by its inverse. So you have to choose an invertible matrix. And similarity transformations do not change the eigenvalues. So the eigenvalues of the matrix before and after this transformation are exactly the same. And so what is the transformation that you want to do? You want to multiply on the left by d of x star to the negative 1/2, right? So this would be the negative 1 over the square root of the eigenvalues. And then on the right by d x to the 1/2, right? Such that this is a similarity transformation. Now, when I multiply here, what do I get? I get d of x star to 1/2 A d of the x star 1/2. So now I have the same thing on the left and the right. This, because this is a symmetric matrix and this is the transpose of each other, it's a congruence. it's a congruent matrix. So congruent matrices, they don't have the same eigenvalues, but they have the same number of positive, negative, and zero eigenvalues. Therefore, this matrix is similar to, so A is similar, D of X star is similar to this matrix, which is congruent to this, to A, and therefore, if you have A with only negative eigenvalues, yes, you can pick any positive X, multiply dx star A, you will also have negative eigenvalues. Okay, so in this case, it makes a lot of sense to think about A in isolation. When, however, this is not true, so this matrix is not symmetric, then you can have that A has, I don't know, only eigenvalues with negative real part, but dx star A has not, right? And just to sear this into your memory, I just want to show you one example of this that I'm not going to do on the board because it's boring, but you can see that we have a matrix A here, which is a perfectly reasonable matrix of interactions. And this matrix has three eigenvalues, one that is negative, and two that are conjugate complex numbers, right? This is always going to be the case if you have a matrix with only real numbers. All the complex roots have to be conjugate, right? So if we have the plus I version of it, we have to have the negative I version of it. But you can see that these complex numbers have a negative real part. So if we were to choose, for example, X star to be ones, right? So these we multiply by the identity matrix, we would find that this system is stable, locally stable. But then for some X star, right? Imagine that instead of having 1, 1, 1, we put 1, 1, and 1/2, right? And which you can do by choosing, for example, this growth rate. You would obtain this other matrix, and this other matrix now the two roots have a positive real part, right? So this equilibrium is not stable. Okay, so just looking at A without the X star, it's only like half of the mass, they would say in Italian. It's not like the full mass. It doesn't count for a Sunday because it depends really on the value of X stars.
So suppose I was thinking about this in the context of some sort of evolution where there are mutations that can happen and they're selected in the usual way. Which of these things can change independently, the A's and the R's?
That's a good question. Like if you think about one population by itself, you would think mostly the R, right? Like if I can find a gene that gives me longevity or higher fecundity, probably it's going to be positively under positive selection. If you're thinking in the case of coevolution, maybe being able to evade predators, right? It's a case in which you would change the A's, right? Like all the things that we think about, like mollusks having shells or crabs having like armors, etc. They're really to decrease the negative effect of the predators. And similarly, jaguars running very fast, it's a way to increase these coefficients, right? So in the context of a community, we can think of changing both the R and the A. Does this answer your question? All right. So now, like to what everybody wanted to know this morning, which is how do we do global stability of Lotka-Volterra, and we can talk more about Lyapunov functions. So this what we just did is like called local asymptotic stability. Local because it only holds for very small perturbations. Asymptotic because we're just saying that eventually the system will go back to the equilibrium, but we're not making any claims on how long will it take. We're just saying for t that goes to infinity, yes, it will go back to where it was before. And so like for global asymptotic stability, what we mean is we have a system and we want to prove some stronger results saying that any perturbation that is short of extinction, right? So any perturbation that doesn't kill completely one of the populations will subside eventually, right? So that we can start our orbits, our trajectories in any point in the positive orthant. And if we wait for long enough, it's going to be going to an equilibrium. Of course, this is a very, very strong notion of stability. But as we will see in like some of the applications that we do in the following lectures, there are cases in which it's reasonable to think of models that have these properties. And then, as we were discussing this morning, it's not easy, right, to do global stability analysis. Fundamentally, why? Because when we have this system of nonlinear coupled differential equations, we cannot really write the solution, right? Because otherwise we could say, write the solution, take the limit of t that goes to infinity. If that is X star, you prove your result, right? But you cannot do that. So what we're going to do is, inspired by our friend Alexander Lyapunov, is to use some sort of proxy function, which we call a Lyapunov function, that is positive everywhere in the positive orthant or in the area of interest for our dynamics. And then it's 0 at the equilibrium. And so if we have a positive function that always declines in time and is 0 at equilibrium, then we're saying this thing goes to the equilibrium. So this is easier said than done in many cases, but it is a beautiful idea, right? Because the way I tend to think about this is like we're taking some sort of summary statistics of the system, right? So we're taking some measure that maps our system, right? This function that we write v of x, it typically maps, goes between Rn and R, right? So it takes like an n-dimensional point and summarizes it into one number, right? So we map these things. And so like historically, there have been two main candidate Lyapunov functions, exactly because it's so difficult then to find, Lyapunov function for a system that you've never seen before. There is this sort of memory that is accumulating of people that have had success with certain functional forms. And so these functional forms that had success in the past, we call them candidate Lyapunov functions. Maybe sometimes it's a little too optimistic, but they worked in the past, so why not work also for your model? And so the first one was proposed by Robert MacArthur, in the context of this symmetric Lotka-Volterra that we just seen, like when we were discussing local stability. This actually, if you think about the history of this, it's very interesting. It actually comes from evolution. So this is there is a way to write like Fisher fundamental theorem in terms of a Lyapunov function for a certain dynamics of the different alleles in the population. And so it turns out that the paper by MacArthur was reviewed by Otto Kimura, that is like the father of neutral evolution, who knew about Fisher's theorem. So Kimura suggested this function. So if you look at the acknowledgements of the first PNAS paper on this, that is like 1969, you can see that the reviewers were Otto Kimura and Richard Levontin. Why do I get the reviewers that I get? Right, like my reviewers are never useful. And these people, let me write the Lyapunov function for you. Yeah, never happened to me. All right. So this is like the first function. I'm going to write a slightly different function because there's different, a way to write Lyapunov functions, and MacArthur uses a different one where functions go up instead of going down. So I wrote something that goes down and is 0 at equilibrium, but it's essentially the same function of MacArthur. Just to give you a sense, right? Like let's call this function w of x. And so we have our GLV with R and A that is symmetric. So that's the setting. And so we take R transpose X. So this, imagine if you want to write it in component form, is the sum of Ri Xi. Okay. And then we're going to subtract. This is at equilibrium. Let's say that there is an equilibrium that is positive, just for simplicity. And then we subtract 2 R transpose X plus X transpose AX. Okay, this one in component form. So this will be like that. Minus 2 sum over I of Ri Xi plus sum over I and sum over J of Aij Xi Xj. Right, this is this quadratic form here. Okay, so this is in vector form, in component form. All right, the first thing I want to show you is that this function indeed is 0 at equilibrium. I'm not going to tell you it's positive, we will see that later, but I just want to show you that this is 0 at equilibrium. And to do this, we can use a very nice property that we're going to use again. So I just want to spend 1 second showing you. Like if we have x dot is diagonal of x, R plus AX, and we have an equilibrium that is positive, then what we're saying is that this system is at equilibrium because this part is 0 at equilibrium. But this part being 0 at equilibrium means that R plus AX star is equal to 0, which means that for example, R is equal to negative AX star. Okay, so instead of writing the system in R and A, we can equivalently, when we have a feasible equilibrium, write it in terms of A and X star. So we get rid of the R's altogether, right? We embed them in the equilibrium. Okay, so then if we're looking at this thing at equilibrium, right? So imagine that we're substituting here the equilibrium, here the equilibrium, here the equilibrium. What do we get? We get R transpose X star minus 2. Sorry, let's put the parenthesis here. 2R transpose X star, right? But this R transpose, we could write, for example, minus X transpose A transpose, if we want, plus X transpose A X star, right? So we can do different things. And because this matrix is symmetric, for example, this one we could write it, put a transpose here. It's symmetric, doesn't matter. But then this one is what? It's negative R. Right? So we would get R transpose X star minus 2R transpose X star minus R transpose X star, right? Where we substituted here that. Right? So we substituted AX star for this. And so now we get equal to 0, right? Because we have 2, 1, and then 1 minus 1, 0. Okay, so that says that this function is 0 at equilibrium. And now we can say, if this matrix A not only is symmetric, but it's negative definite, then it will be, this is a convex function, so it will have only a minimum at 0, which means that it's going to be always positive otherwise. Okay, so that's the last part that we're going to do. So we take this function, and now we take derivative with respect to time, and show that this derivative with respect to time is always declining if A is negative definite. So we want to take W dot of X. So we would get R transpose X star. It goes away, so this one we don't have anymore. Negative of 2. Sorry. Let me write it like this. Negative of 2 R transpose X dot, right, from here. And then this, because it's symmetric, we would get X dot AX plus X transpose AX dot. But because it's symmetric, we can switch the signs. So we should get plus 2, let's say, for example, A transpose X transpose A transpose X dot, or A X dot. Okay, and this one we can write explicitly. We can take this thing out, minus 2. Then we have R plus A, the whole thing transposed, times X dot, minus 2, R plus A transpose diagonal of X. We substitute the equation here. R plus A X, sorry, here there should be A X. Yes, A X. And so this, you can see that it's a quadratic form. Each one is multiplied by this, and it's easier to see actually this one if we write it in component form. Minus 2, sum over I of xi, that is from here, times, and here we would get ri plus the sum over j of aij xj, which is this part, squared, right? But this square, so this cannot be negative. This one is positive by definition, and this is a negative sign, so this function always declines in time. All right, and then, so this says there's some quantity that it's always declining in time, and if this matrix is negative definite, then this function is convex, so 0 would be the minimum. So this function is always positive. It's like a cup, right? There's only one minimum at 0. Okay, so this is the Lyapunov function by MacArthur. So it's an example of a candidate function that you can find for Lotka-Volterra. Anybody has seen something like this before? Or is this clear enough? Because now I'm going to do a slight generalization. Yes, we're good? A being symmetric means like the effect of species I on J is exactly the same of that of species J on I, right? So that they for example, decrease each other growth of the same amount. Yeah, this symmetry arises quite naturally if you have some processes that are based on similarity, right? Imagine that we're saying we interact very strongly if we're very similar, and we interact not so strongly if we're very different. So anything like that distance between two things is symmetric, right? So it's a positive definite operator. So you would get interactions that would be at this point symmetric. So you can think about, I don't know, phylogenetic relatedness, right? How far like ago did we split from each other, right? Like when is our universal common ancestor or things like that, right? Or anything based on distance, right? We compete strongly if we have similar diets, and not so strongly if we have different diets. That would be another case in which we would expect things to be about symmetric. Yeah, so it's not only mathematical convenience. When you do like a consumer resource model and you can do this trick of like making some dynamics fast and some slow, you would get a symmetric matrix in return. So this thing arises quite often. Oh, that's not going to be symmetric. That's going to be skew symmetric if we're lucky, right? that you could do, but like this would have different signs. Yes, so this is more for things competing with each other or things helping each other out, right? Which is some cases of dynamics. All right, so this is very special because it requires this assumption that we might or might not want to make, right? For example, as you were saying, for predator-prey dynamics would not make much sense. So we can have another Lyapunov function, a candidate Lyapunov function that was derived instead of MacArthur by B.S. Go. The negative I not use. This is always going to decline in time, but then this will be a minimum, right? Only if this matrix is negative definite, then it would have a minimum at exactly X star. Right, and the minimum we decided is 0. So then it means that the function is always positive, and it's always declining in time, and it has a single minimum at equilibrium. If this is not positive definite, it means that this is not guaranteed to be the minimum, right? Because this need not to be a convex function anymore. Okay, so we have a function, right, which we did not know whether it's positive or negative, right? We just know that this function always declines in time. That we can prove, right? Like independent of whether A is that's this result. Exactly. This one is a quadratic form, right? So, and this thing can only be positive or 0. This thing is a square, so it can be a positive or 0. So it has to decline in time. Now the problem is what? That the notion of a Lyapunov function is not only this thing declines in time, but it has a single minimum, and the minimum is attained in equilibrium, right? So if this matrix is a quadratic form, right? So you can think of this as like a constant plus a vector plus like a matrix, right? So this form is going to have a single minimum at exactly A inverse negative of A inverse R, if and only if this matrix A is negative definite, right? In which case, this is a convex function, it has a single minimum, so it has all the things that we like, right? Because if it is a single minimum and the minimum is at 0, it means that the function must be positive, right? Because otherwise it wouldn't have a minimum at 0. Okay, so if we have negative definiteness, this becomes a Lyapunov function. If not, we could have like the system gets stuck in some other point, right? That it does not need to be the equilibrium where all the species are existing. But yeah, but this function declines in time irrespective of that. All right, I think we have time for another Lyapunov function. Then there's a third thing that I want to say about Lyapunov functions, but I can do this on my next lecture, which I think is going to be on Wednesday. Is that correct? So you have time to mull this over. So this is like a function that was due to BS Go, and it's in fact like the extension of the constant of motion that both Lotka and Volterra found for their predator-prey system. So this uses the same logic. We're going to write it as V of x is just the sum over I. We're going to do like first the simplest form, and then I'm just going to do a very, very marginal generalization of this. So this function, if you take a single x, right, and this x is positive, this function is positive for each I, right? So we're summing positive functions, which means that this function is positive. This function is zero at equilibrium, because you can see that this would become xi star minus xi star is 0, and xi star over xi star is 1, and log of 1 is 0, right? So this is 0 at equilibrium, it's always positive. So what remains to be seen is whether this function declines in time, right? It decreases in time. Now we can see that this is the case when, let's try to take the derivative with respect to time. We differentiate with respect to time v. So we would get sum over I of xi dot from here. This one is a constant, so it becomes 0. And then here we would get minus xi star. And then log of xi would be xi dot over xi. Okay, so this is our derivative with respect to time. And now we can substitute here our dynamics. So here we would get xi times ri plus ax component I. I'm just going to write like this, not to write the sum. And then here we have minus xi star times this one divided by xi, so we just get ri plus ax component I. Okay, so you can see that these two parts of the equation have the same part in parentheses, and they only differ here. So we can create this xi minus xi star. It's something that we've seen before. We called it delta x when we were doing local stability analysis. So we can write this as of delta xi times ri plus ax component I. And then here we're going to do the same trick that we did before. If we're saying if there is a positive equilibrium, then ri is what? It's negative of ax star, right? So then we have ax minus ax star, that's a delta x, right? So we can write this as sum over I delta xi times a delta x component I, which we can write as sum over I sum over j of delta xi aij delta xj. Okay, so you can see this, we have a quadratic form. In fact, if we write this in vector notation, we would get x transpose ax, right? This quadratic form is negative when A is negative definite. But negative definiteness is really defined only for symmetric matrices. And you can see that like when you have this quadratic form, only the symmetric part of the matrix matter, right? Like because if I have that Aij is a symmetric part plus a skew symmetric part, eventually I'm going to sum also Aj I, so the skew symmetric part will cancel. Right? So this one you can write it as 1/2 x transposed of A plus A transposed x. And we call this the Hermitian part of A, or the symmetric part of A, right? So the only thing that matters for this stability is that the symmetric part of A, right? So it's like the part that is present in both Aij and Aji, this matrix has to be negative definite. If this is the case, this is a Lyapunov function for the system when it is feasible. Okay, now is this clear enough? Because we have another 5 minutes. I wanted to say just one other thing about this, but first I want to make sure that you follow what we were saying, right? So this is a function, always positive, zero at equilibrium, and then we took the derivative with respect to time, and we can see that this a sufficient condition for this function to decrease in time is that the symmetric part of A is negative definite. Yes. Okay, because with this we're going to use over and over, so I want to make sure that you understand. And then I just want to show you, like, when you read the paper by Go, it's not written like exactly like this. They have a slightly more general statement, and I wanted to show you how does this general statement come about. What you find in Go is that says there exists a vector W greater than 0. Right? Imagine a vector of positive numbers such that D of W times A plus A transpose D of W is negative definite. Okay, which is almost the same, right? If we were to choose all the W's once, we would have had exactly the derivation that we had. But this is for a generic thing, and I feel that the simplest way to prove this case, instead of writing a more complicated Lyapunov function, is to do a change of variable. Right? So imagine that I'm saying, instead of measuring my dynamics for x, I define z of I, which is x of I over wi, where wi is greater than 0 for all I. And then I have, by definition, that xi is equal to wi zi. Okay, so what happens when I do this change of variables in Lotka-Volterra? And this change of variables is like, I'm taking the first species was measured in kilograms, and now I measure it in pounds. The second species was measured in kilograms, and now I measure it in grams. The third one was measured, and I measured it some other, like in stones or some other units of measure that people invented to confuse us when we go like to the gym, right? So I do this kind of, I choose each species, I measure it in its own unit of measure, which is defined by this wi. Then if I take the dynamics of zi dot, right, and changing unit of measure, it's not going to change the existence of an equilibrium, it's not going to change the type of dynamics, it's not going to change the stability of the equilibrium, because we're just like measuring things in different ways, right? So we have that zi dot is going to be xi dot over wi, which is going to be xi over wi, and then ri plus sum over j or times plus ax component I. Okay, so what is this? This is zi. And then here we have written this in terms of x. We want to write it in terms of z. So we can take the axis and put w z here, right? And so we would get ri plus a diagonal of w z component I. Okay, and so call this matrix a diagonal of w, right? We were saying call a diagonal of w, I don't know, a tilde, right? Now this is a Lotka-Volterra system, but with a tilde instead of a, right? It has the same growth rate as before. As if before we had a positive equilibrium, we still do. And so now, like, the condition would be a tilde is the Hermitian part of a tilde is negative definite. But this is to say that the Hermitian part of diagonal of w a, or if you prefer transpose, doesn't matter, right? Like you can take either way because you're taking the symmetric part, is negative definite. And so that's how you get this condition by Go in a simple way, right? And without having to do the calculation again. Okay, and I think we can stop here. We did more than I expected to, so I'll just take a few questions and then we can break for coffee. So there are matrices that like A plus A transpose is not negative definite, but you can find the W such that this thing is now negative definite. So it extends the reach of this Lyapunov function quite considerably. That's why it's important to include it. Yes, like, so the negative definite, I think it's well defined only for symmetric matrices. So for symmetric matrices, there's no problem. Yeah, if it's symmetric, then this is also gonna be symmetric, it's gonna be negative. The problem is when A is non-symmetric, right? Now this Lyapunov function is dealing especially with this case. Of course, it includes the other one by definition, right? Because I choose W to be 1, right? Like, and then I get exactly the same conditions for negative definiteness exactly as I had for MacArthur. But there are cases in which the symmetric part of A is not negative definite, and yet you can find positive numbers such that now the symmetric part of this modified matrix is negative definite.
Also, the first Lyapunov function,
Mm-hmm.
where did you use the fact that A is negative definite?
So this was the same question that we had before, and it's a bit of a point of confusion. So let me reiterate. So we have a function. To be a Lyapunov function in the sense that we want it has to be positive, 0 only at equilibrium, declining in time. Okay, so here we start from the third condition. Does it decline in time? We're saying yes, it declines in time, always, irrespective of anything. The problem is this positive? Does this have only an equilibrium, right? Because it has to reach 0 at equilibrium, right? So we know that if there is a feasible equilibrium, this will be 0 at equilibrium, which is good. So we match condition 2 and 3. We're just missing, is it positive? And is it gonna go there, right? So if you have a quadratic form, maybe I can write it here. If you have something like of this form, this is something you find, where is our engineer? This is something you find in control theory a lot, right? Like these quadratic forms. Imagine that you have this function, right? Whatever function you want. F is like a constant plus, say, a vector. So this is a generic quadratic form, right? And so like there is this good result that says if B is negative definite, then F is convex, which means it's like a cup, right? It has a single minimum, and the minimum is obtained for the solution of the system Bx is equal to A, which is exactly our condition for the equilibrium. Okay, so in that case, if this matrix is negative definite, we're saying, yes, this function is convex, so it has a single minimum. We know what is the value of the function at the minimum. It's 0, which means what? That the function has to be positive, always. Okay, so that, like, to do just the first condition, we had to go through a little bit of a roundabout. Yes?
The motivation theory of this will be A where you can.
So suppose you have some A where you can prove things, and then for a nearby A, some results follow.
Yes, yes, because like, for example, eigenvalues are continuous function of the coefficient. So if I change the coefficient very slightly, right, it should change the eigenvalues very slightly.
That's true.
That's true, yeah, like eigenvalues are continuous function of the coefficients.
The population abundance Xi's. And I'm wondering if there's a correspondence between perturbing the abundances and the coefficients.
Yeah, it's very different monsters, right? Like here we're perturbing the abundances. We're saying the rules of the games do not change, right? They're fixed, and we're only changing the abundance. There are ways to go about like robustness, like structural robustness of this model, which would be how much do the results change if I change very slightly the parameters. It gets a little more involved than this.
Thank you.
All right, I don't want to cut over all your coffee breaks, so I would say we can break, and then I will hang around and you can ask me more questions if something is burning. Otherwise, you can wait until Wednesday or tomorrow when we're going on a walk. I'm captive in this walk, and you can ask whatever you want. Thank you.